Okay, so we're in part 14 of People Are Complicated. We're in 2 Samuel 9, 1 through 13, David's kindness to Mephibosheth. I'll read the text aloud, and then we'll begin with just your what stands out to you, what questions it raises for you. David asked, "Is there still anyone left of the house of Saul to whom I may show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and he was summoned to David. The king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" And he said, "At your service." The king said, "Is there anyone remaining of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?" Ziba said to the king, "There remains a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in his feet." The king said to him, "Where is he?" Ziba said to the king, "He is in the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lodabar." Then King David sent and brought him from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lodabar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and did obeisance. David said, "Mephibosheth." He answered, "I am your servant." David said to him, "Do not be afraid, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you yourself shall eat at my table always." He did obeisance and said, "What is your servant that you should look upon a dead dog such as I?" Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said to him, "All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. You and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, so that your master's grandson may have food to eat. But your master's grandson, Mephibosheth, shall always eat at my table." Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, "According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do." Mephibosheth ate at David's table, like one of the king's sons. Mephibosheth had a young son whose name was Micah, and all who lived in Ziba's house became Mephibosheth's servants. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he always ate at the king's table. Now he was lame in both his feet. Okay, what do you notice? What stands out to you? What questions does the text raise?
Was he crippled or not?
I don't seem to stress that enough.
Yeah.
It does feel like undue attention is given to that.
What does obeisance mean?
Oh,
Not a word I use.
I've never heard that one.
I know what Lodabar means. Nothing.
Art, I figured that's what Julie does. She shows you deference, reverence.
Obeisance.
She's laughing a little too hard. What else? What stands out to you in the text?
That's kind of a silly detail that stand out, but it kind of did. So in verse 4, and then in 5, the fact that he defines him so carefully that this person is from the house of Machir, son of Amiel, at Lodabar, and then he said, and then again he's from the house. Every repetition of such a detail into our minds is kind of like we just read right over it because none of these words mean anything to us. But to me, so that says to me, it meant something to these people.
Yep.
The place and so forth meant something to them. Therefore, it's not just like one in some faraway kingdom in the land of law, there was a person who blah blah blah. No, this is a specific person, specific place and time.
Yeah, that's interesting. And he will show up again in David's story.
Mhm.
So it feels like maybe a little forecasting,
Mm.
you know, that guy.
Mhm.
Well, I find it a little odd that kindness was provided for someone else's sake. You know, David
Yeah.
said, "I'll provide you kindness for Jonathan's sake," and it shows up in two spots. And what about for his sake? You know, it just seems odd.
I mean, it
Right.
seems like, that it is a lot of, it's a lot of mercy. Now, obviously, he's meaning that, usually you killed off all the relatives of the previous guy.
Yeah, right.
And so, but he's promised it. I mean, we've seen that already, that he's promising it to Jonathan, whom he was really close to, obviously. And so it's not surprising,
Mm.
but it is surprising when you look at the rest of Israel's history. They don't do that.
Right. Yeah, it stands out. Yeah. Which
I
may be
was
why the
taken
story's here.
by his zeal, his determination to bring blessings and goodness on everybody in that community,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
how thorough he seems to be in trying
Yeah.
to do that.
Yeah. I just jotted a few things down, to start with. Um, he is crippled in his feet. That's the primary identity given. So we learn that before we learn. And of course, the direct reference here is 2 Samuel 4:4. Saul's son Jonathan had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, and in her haste to flee, it happened that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. Yeah, I also noticed that there's a lot going on with the word kindness, or it's the Hebrew word chesed. But there's kindness for the sake of Jonathan, but then it's also called the kindness of God. There's so interesting contrast. And just noticing the last line of the story. Once again, now he was lame in both feet. By the way, just in case you forgot, it just feels odd.
Well, obviously, there must be, to me, I think of this as, in that culture, is a sense of shame in it.
Mhm.
And because he that says of himself, he says that you should look upon a dead dog such as I.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that I can't imagine saying it any more clearly than I'm ashamed of myself.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
um,
not just a dog,
yeah,
but a dead dog.
yeah, a dead dog. So there's that sense of so that it feels like that this kindness is in contrast to the way the culture usually looks at a disability.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, very much so.
Mhm.
Greetings, Robert. We see you. Glad you're here. Okay, we'll move into the story. So there are really three stories of Mephibosheth in the David story. So we'll touch on number one and number three. Number two is the story that we've just read here, but it is kind of helpful to remember the rest of the story here. So to help me do that, I'm using Eugene Peterson's book Leap Over a Wall, because I felt like he had pretty helpful summaries of the stories 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so Mephibosheth, story number 1. So here's what Peterson writes. When Mephibosheth was 5 years old, news came to Saul's palace in Gibeon that King Saul and Prince Jonathan had just been killed by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa in the Battle of Jezreel. Panic was immediate and total. The Philistines were ruthless. With Saul and his sons dead, the royal house and everyone in it were slated for destruction. Not knowing what to expect except the worst, all the servants in the palace ran for their lives. 5-year-old Mephibosheth's nurse grabbed him on the run and then tripped. In the fall, the boy's ankles were broken, both ankles. So that's 2 Samuel 4. He was carried with the troops of escaping household servants across the Jordan River Valley to the safety of the small village of Lo Debar. The bones knit badly. Mephibosheth was never able to walk well. He grew up in obscurity, lame. Mephibosheth was the only living heir of the once great house of Saul, but nobody knew, because his life would have been in danger if that information were revealed. He grew up with his royal identity suppressed, grew up with all the privileges of royalty denied him, and both conditions were aggravated by his lameness. So we might just stop there and just ask, what do you think it was like for Mephibosheth growing up in these circumstances?
Lonely,
Lonely.
isolating.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Laconia and Debbie and I saw one of the episodes from the Chosen of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda.
Mm.
And the story is really well developed of lame at birth, you
Mm.
know, what it's like as a child, what it's like, you know, and so that kind of helps you.
Mm.
I can visualize that story as I'm looking at this one.
Yeah.
He was doing a little worse than Mephibosheth, though.
Yeah.
It seemed like Mephibosheth was still surrounded by people that were taking care of him.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, he certainly had some resources here.
Mhm.
Okay, let's jump into story number 2, which is really what we're focusing on tonight. So this is Peterson's summary. The second Mephibosheth story took place years later. Mephibosheth was now an adult, still cruelly handicapped because of the accident. And then a day came when strangers arrived in Lo Debar asking for him. They found him and told him that he was wanted in Jerusalem by King David. The summons to present himself before David could have struck terror in him. Only one interpretation could be put on the summons. David was searching the land from top to bottom, looking for any trace of Saul's descendants, determined to eliminate any possible future challenges to his kingdom. Mephibosheth was put on a donkey and taken to Jerusalem. Every step brought him nearer to his anticipated doom. The wretched tale of his victimized life would terminate now in a bloody execution. Mephibosheth perceived himself as royal scum. He felt less than human, calling himself a dead dog. He bleated in embittered terror before David. Observing his terror, David addressed him by name, Mephibosheth. What Mephibosheth didn't know was that he was brought into David's court and could never have imagined in his wild dreams is that he was there to be loved. What Mephibosheth didn't know was that he was standing before a very different kind of king than the world in which he had grown up had any right to expect. The suspicious paranoia that had characterized his grandfather's reign was absent here. The maniacal jealousies that had infected Saul's court were remote here. David emerges into prominence here as a lover. His kingly rule was already marked by justice and fairness. There is, though, an element without which those qualities aren't complete, and that element is love. Mephibosheth had never, or at least not for a long time, been loved like this. David's first word to Mephibosheth is the young man's name. Mephibosheth is recognized as a person. He isn't a nameless exile. He isn't a category of a victim. He has a name, and David knows it, Mephibosheth. We can't love in general. We can't love by categories. We can't love by decree or legislation. We can only love a named person who has a past, a present, and a future. David put content into the word love when he turned over to Mephibosheth all the lands of his grandfather Saul, so that he would have an independent income. Assigned Ziba, who had once been servant to Saul, to manage the farms and take care of his affairs, and brought Mephibosheth into his household as one of the family. This is the way love looks, not feels: generous, extravagant, uncalculating. And then just some notes here from a variety of commentators. Through this narrative, the biblical writer portrays David as the supreme Israelite example of covenant faithfulness, or chesed, the highest virtue in Hebrew society. So we might look at this story primarily as a story about chesed and what that looks like in the life of David. 3 times, Brueggemann points out 3 times in this paragraph that word is used: verse 1, verse 3, verse 7. So it's clearly thematic. David throws the net wider than his promises required, extending his generosity to any of Saul's surviving sons or grandsons. Through his inquiry, David learned that there was still a son of Jonathan, apparently living with a wife and a son, in a self-imposed internal exile at the house of Machir, son of Amiel, in Lo-Debar. Machir, mentioned here for the first time, was a wealthy and powerful individual living east of the Jordan at Lo-Debar. Later, he proved to be one of David's most loyal supporters. So maybe that's why attention's drawn to him. The property of the previous regime would have come into David's possession, and to restore that property to a member of his predecessor's family was to turn the risk of encouraging thoughts of usurping the throne. First, David restored to the disfigured, exiled Saulite all the land that belonged to Saul. This would have meant the family estate, located about 3 miles north of Jerusalem in Gibeah, would be returned to Mephibosheth. Second, David gave Mephibosheth a privilege that seemed to have perished the day his father Jonathan died: the right to board at the king's table always. And third, David provided Mephibosheth with a large contingent of servants and material wealth. His reference to himself as a dead dog is unnecessarily disparaging and reflects what would now be regarded as morbid self-image, induced perhaps by his disability. Ziba's 15 sons and 20 servants ensure that there will be people with the necessary training and skill to manage these states efficiently. And then the kindness of God, verse 3, on which David modeled his kindness, was not limited but freely given to the undeserving as an act of free grace. Jonathan had given gracious help to David when he was driven from the king's table, and now David has been able to show kindness in return by giving Jonathan's son security and honor. So we can talk about any of that. I was sort of drawn to these few lines from Peterson. We can't love in general. We can't love by categories. We can't love by decree or legislation. We can only love a named person who has a past, a present, and a future. In what ways do you feel like that's true?
Well, love is about an actual connection, right? A
Hmm.
personal connection, and you need to know what you're connecting to.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Although I do think, because of a natural connection with a person and maybe the dilemma of their life, we then expand our love to other people who face the same dilemma.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been kind of focusing on the disability piece of this, like in that culture, I'm imagining, was a culture that needed people to be healthy, soldiers had to be strong and healthy, farmers, I mean, there wasn't many jobs that you didn't need to be strong and healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were disabled, what could you offer?
Yeah.
You know, it's very unlike our culture, which has much more need of, you know, the knowledge-based jobs.
Yeah.
You know, so maybe you have a disability of the mind, but if your mind is strong, then you have a job no matter what your rest of your body's doing. You hope to have a job. But that would have happened if we didn't have the Americans with Disability Act. And that has, I think, sensitized a large part of it. So there were people, because they were loving people they knew who had disabilities,
Yeah.
promoted and got other people involved to change our culture, change the laws, so that we actually now think about disabled people. Can we get someone with a wheelchair into our building and into all the parts of our worship and so forth? Now, would that have happened? I mean, that's happening because somebody cares about, loves people in the abstract.
Right.
But it started probably with people that cared about individuals.
Yeah. So yeah, the specific face that we learn to love may lead to a love that really is general and broader because of that experience there. Yeah, that's really interesting insight. Yeah. But that does make a lot of sense. Their culture would be largely physical labor based rather than knowledge based. And so for someone like Mephibosheth, I mean, and I guess maybe that's why, you know, he's housed by this powerful, wealthy individual who seems to have the resources to take care of somebody. I've got a question or two. Yeah. So on the back of page 72, I just started jotting down questions. So I'm sort of breaking up here. The back of page 72 under number 4. So in 2 Samuel 9:1-13, Mephibosheth, the last surviving son, has a physical disability, bones that were broken in his feet and legs when he was dropped as a baby, never properly healed. He is, according to the text, crippled in his feet. As an adult, Mephibosheth refers to himself as a dead dog. Most likely, this poor self-image is the result of his disability because of his crippled feet. So a question, what are things in our lives today that lead us to think poorly of ourselves as Mephibosheth did, or to think poorly of others as probably the people around Mephibosheth thought of him? You know, if Mephibosheth was alive today, what might he be struggling with, wrestling with?
I think it's like 180 from what Debbie was talking about, where perhaps today it's based on at least a perceived person intellect. And so if you might be perceived or feel that you're not up to the par with others, you might feel disabled because it's not the same physical, shall we say, culture that existed, you know, hundreds of thousands of years ago. So you could feel inadequate in certain areas that way.
Yeah.
I think the loss of a job,
Yeah.
or feeling that the job that you have is not equal to the skills you have.
Yeah.
Well, every form of prejudice, race, gender, gay, trans. It's you know, I mean, in America, you tend to think we really think well of ourselves. You know, we're pretty self-indulgent people in a lot of ways. But actually, the nation is set up so that everyone gets a chance to think poorly of themselves. I mean, in terms of capitalism as a competitive, it's not cooperative.
Right.
And so if you're not successful in the race to the top, and if you don't have spiritual foundation, you have every reason to feel poor about yourself. You
Right,
didn't win, you're
yeah.
a loser.
Mhm.
I think we're kind of obsessed with, beauty and, I think even weight, we don't, I think that's an important factor that we sometimes judge people by their physical fitness.
Yeah. Mhm.
Youth,
Very good, yep.
aging. Not that I would know anything about that.
I was talking to someone recently who was, discussing his childhood experiences of how his parents parented him. And they thought, writing them, criticizing, rebuking, just always being on their case was gonna make this person become a better person.
Yeah,
Which, I think today we know better, but some years ago, that was how parents thought they were supposed to be, just really hard on your kids.
Yeah.
You really don't let them get away with anything, and you tell them daily that they're not doing the right thing.
Mm.
And guess what? You grow up finding like, I can't do anything right.
mhm.
You don't need to get a big head.
Yeah, it's too
And
bad.
that's one thing they've pretty well succeeded at.
Right, yeah.
So you end up, like really feeling like really hard on yourself.
Hmm.
Well, this is kind of dark, but it jumped out at me that, Mephibosheth did not kill himself on the way to meet David. He thought he was gonna die. And yet he went as a dead dog, metaphorically. And he was surprised. But I wonder if he had thoughts of saying, why don't I just off myself now?
Yeah, that is dark.
So typical. So,
Another question, King David finds Mephibosheth, brings him to the palace, provides resources, keeps a place at his table always for him. This is how David showed love to a person who didn't love himself and who likely was not loved by others. So what are some ways we can express love toward people today who don't love themselves and who may not be loved by others?
Hear them.
Hmm.
Just listen to them, be present. Take them seriously.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a discipline.
Learn their names.
Right, yeah, learn to see them as real people with a name and a face.
I know somebody who really doesn't love themselves too much, doesn't think highly of himself. It's my coke dealer and heroin. And I still keep my hand on his pulse because I know there's hope for him.
Mhm.
He's worked for me in the past, and he's really down on his luck. Okay, but I have to still be careful that I don't get involved with that again.
Mhm.
Because I am an addict, and I don't want to go back to that again. And so today I met him at the hotel, I paid for a couple nights for him, and I gave him a ride somewhere, not for drugs, but for, something else. And I brought him back. And he really thanked me, he thinks me as a friend. I mean, even though we had our disputes, but he thinks me as a friend, because the things I go overboard, in the past, paying his bills and paying for this and, so he just does not love himself. And I reached out with him many times for Jesus, and I just planted the seed, that's all I could do. And I'm not making it grow. But I'm sure in his times of quiet, he thinks of what I said, amongst other things. And he texted me and he said if I have any work for him, can, stop him. To do what he's doing, besides drinking. And, I didn't respond back, but if I have to do that, because he said, if I'm working and I'm not thinking about other things that I'm doing. And can you help me, Jamie? And, I don't care, if he wants a couple $100 today, I give it to him. Well, I paid for 2 rooms, that's no big deal. And like I said, if I could help him out anyway, but like I said, I gotta be careful. I just gotta be very careful.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, and I can appreciate the tension there. Here's somebody who thinks poorly of himself and probably is thought poorly of by a lot of people. And you're trying to love him, show chesed toward him. But you also have to be careful the way that you do that, right?
That's right, I really do.
Yeah.
But how often in life, because we recognize a potential threat, do we say, no, I'm not going to reach that hand out? Seems to me that's pretty generous, Jamie, on your part, given the realities of your life and your situation and what could harm you. You still reach out, you try. Maybe that's what David was really doing.
Today, I've been clean a month,
Yep.
But, it was a blessing in disguise, because he said he was going out of town and he's not coming back, and if I want anything, just to make one big score. So I gave him $1,850 and he disappeared. Okay, chalk it up as a loss, okay? But because of that, I said it's time for me not to be enslaved to this drug anymore.
Yep.
It's time to get clean. And I've been clean a month. No fentanyl, no heroin, no coke, no nothing. And first 5 days were miserable, really miserable. And but it was a blessing in disguise, even though he beat me. He just it was a blessing in disguise because that's when I started. It was the last time, Wednesday night a month ago. I did like my last bump. And
we're grateful to hear that, James. Yeah, we are. And that's part of learning to love yourself, also. And to think more highly of yourself.
Yeah, I don't care if you beat me for $1,850. I'm still there for him. I don't care. My heart, the money was really not an option. But I'm there for him still.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Yeah.
But Jamie, for trusting us with that information, okay? Because we worry about you. We worry about you. We want you to be healthy and happy and free of this addiction. But it sure helps to know how much you trust us.
All the way, I trust you. Dale, Debbie's, especially I gave him information, that I don't really reveal to nobody else, Art and Julie, so I trust the family and I trust certain individuals. Bingo.
Dale, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna say to Jamie, you've always been characterized by friendship to people in trouble. You've never looked down on anybody. And it's not just about Michael, it's just you've often been generous to people who are taking a beating from life and from society. That's to your credit.
But that's why you need to survive, Jamie. There are a lot of people who could use your help.
Yeah, a lot depends on you.
I thought about that Wednesday night when I did my last bump, and I says, here it goes. He didn't show up,
Hmm.
kept me hanging, you know, it was supposed to deliver, never came through. And so I had a good 2 months supply, you know, but just grateful he didn't show up.
Yeah. Let me ask this third question here. So all of this in the text is called the kindness of God. So in verse 3, which I think is probably the sort of the theological center of it, the chesed of God, the kindness of God. That's what David says he's attempting to display here. What he does for Mephibosheth is he's enacting the kindness of God. So he's trying to provide Mephibosheth a kindness that looks like God's kindness. So a series of questions. In what ways had David experienced God's kindness? And how might this have inspired him to provide kindness to Mephibosheth? And then how have you experienced God's kindness through the actions of another person? So for David, what does God's kindness look like? How had he experienced that to this point in his life?
Well, he's God's anointed. A lot has gone right for him.
Mhm.
And, you know, I mean, we know later he makes some major mistakes and his life takes a downturn. But what I'm surprised by and reminded of something I'd forgotten, which is you can go an awful long ways into the books of Samuel. And David's still doing pretty well, which this story is another indication of David doing pretty well.
Mhm. Mhm.
From
Yeah, so-
one perspective, I mean, last week we looked at a parallel account in First Chronicles of the same. You will not build me a house, I will build you a house. But in First Chronicles, it is where it's added to the account that the reason you will not build the temple is because you are too bloody. You know, you've fought too many wars and killed too many people. And so I mean, it's complicated. I mean,
both things are
complicated
true
the whole way.
Yeah.
And the texts are complicated. I mean, it's not these two texts are competing with one another, but they're not telling the same story.
Yeah.
I mean, they have a very different perspective, and that's the nature of scripture. Where I was taught that scripture was very plain and simple and blah 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 blah, and that evidently came from people who hadn't read it or given it no thought when they did read it. Because the multiple perspectives are all over the place.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. You know, I think about all the ways that in those sort of wilderness years of David, you know, there's a sense that God is providing for him, taking care of him. That was part of David's experience of Hesed as well, the kindness of God.
I just note a general principle in this set of questions that when you feel right with God, it's a whole lot easier to be kind to other people, take risks to, but when you feel detached or conflictual with God, it's a lot harder to be kind.
Yeah, it is. How would you say you've experienced God's kindness through another person?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at that question in one perspective. I thought you the kindness of other people in one sense is always God's kindness. It always, you know, almost always goes back to God in a sense, but I also, you know, it reminded me of Debbie's and my blizzard story of driving through Canada on the way to my parents' home one night when they were not expecting us, and a blizzard hits us, and we're we're going down 4-lane highway behind 18-wheelers, and that's the only way we can see where we are. And then we have about 40 miles to go on 2-lane roads, and it's about midnight. And we spent about an hour on that road and haven't really seen anybody. It's now maybe 1 o'clock or well past midnight. And we finally go off the road into a bank. And exactly at that moment, lights come through the darkness, pickup truck, a guy comes right up to us, stops. Oh, my shovel broke. I get out to shovel, and the shovel breaks. At that point, the guy shows up in the pickup truck, shows us how to turn the wheel, gets us out of there, and it seems like, and I don't know if I'm being proverbial now, but it seems like before you could even turn and thank him, it was taillights.
Oh, wow.
It was just,
Yeah.
I mean, the car was unheated. Marcus was less than 3 years old in the back seat.
Wow.
I drove that car in wintertime,
Yeah, the heater was broken.
the Ford Fairlane, Maverick, sorry.
Yeah, so definitely an experience of God's kindness.
Mhm.
Yeah, just out of nowhere. Yeah, goodness.
I think I have a similar story. In 1970, I was told by a white police officer that if I didn't call him sir, he'd shoot me and kill me and nobody would ever find me. And in 1997, after telling stories for an hour, in the interim, anytime I got stopped by cops, I would be nervous. But in 1997, I was telling stories in Hartford, and a white police officer came up to me and told me that he really enjoyed the storytelling. But what I'll always remember is that he said, "Sir, can I speak to you for a moment?" And he called me sir first. And I think and just like Dale's story, when I looked for him, he was gone. His name was Officer Nitty.
Yeah.
Nitti. Probably one of 11 Italian Catholic kids.
That's fascinating.
I know it's coming, towards the close of the class, and I'm not in the doghouse, at least I don't think so. But I experience God's love through Julie. She gives it to me all the time. And so it's through relationships that you get to experience that. And so
Yeah.
with that, I think I'm set for at least this evening.
No, I was gonna say the same thing. I mean, I think sometimes in our closest relationships, certainly I feel a lot of kindness through the church members, but it's such it's a great base to know that you can experience that at home, consistently, and obviously it gives you a perspective to be able to offer that to others.
Yes.
Julie, you and Art are an MAS.
Can't wait to hear what that means.
Mutual Admiration Society.
It's supposed to be.
Give me a kiss, dear.
Chris,
Yes, Robert.
yeah, I think David must have experienced God love or protection by the fact that all the times that Saul tried to attack him and he was spared.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so he experienced the protection of God, and now he's protecting Mephibosheth. Yeah.
I'm kind of finding it interesting though, is that evidently he could experience this being chased and having to hide in this time in the wilderness, and still see the God's protection. Like maybe other might have said, well, this is not much fun. Where is God now? So this is not good. This is not what's supposed to be happening to me.
Right. Yeah.
It seems pretty, like I feel pretty wretched right now. One more night in the cave.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in this story, I wonder how really happy Ziba is about everything.
Hmm.
You know, at some point in time, oh, you get to take care of Mephibosheth, you and your whole family are his. Well, thank you, king. You know, I'm
Yeah.
not so sure, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, because then in the third story about Mephibosheth, in the revolt of Absalom, you get two different stories. You get Ziba's story, who tells David, "Oh, Mephibosheth stayed in Jerusalem while you left because he's planning to usurp the throne." And then you get Mephibosheth's story, which is Ziba abandoned me, and I couldn't do anything but stay here because I'm lame. And so, you know, it makes you wonder about,
Yes, exactly.
you know, just
It
how we
adds
felt
to the
about all this.
intrigue there.
Yeah.
I mean, but I thought that third story, as you wrote it here, you made a good point, which that the story doesn't really tell you who's telling the truth,
Mhm.
and it doesn't appear that David even cares.
Yeah.
He's still going to act in good faith, even though he has no real certainty of who's telling the truth here.
Mhm.
He still continues to, and I mean, and you know, over the years, you move from you only trust the people who are trustworthy
Mhm.
to just saying, you know, I'm going to try to do the right thing by this person,
Mhm.
and it's up to them. I can't know. I can't really know whether this person's shooting straight or not.
Yeah.
But that's really on them. It's not on me.
Mhm.
And that's maybe something like what David's doing. Although he seems even more noble than that.
Yeah, but it is a remarkable, the way the Mephibosheth stories move, they end, and I think we'll have time on one of these Wednesday nights to look at that text more closely, but it ends with David showing kindness both to Mephibosheth and Ziba, in spite of this, that we as the readers are wondering, who's telling the truth here, who's right and who's wrong, and for David, it seems that love covers all that. Just going to bring them both back into Jerusalem at the end of this revolt.
And I've seen, the love, through Sandy, you know, when I was DTing, you know, for the 5 days, you know, besides cursing me up and down, she was taking care of me. And you should have heard her. But she took care of me. She was really there and got what I needed, and I couldn't even walk. I couldn't even barely talk. I couldn't move it. And strength, it's something you will never experience unless you know, were addicted. And so anyways, I seen Jesus through her.
Yeah.
You hold on to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Nobody said that.
We will say Sandy was speaking in tongues.
She gave it to me too, both barrels.
What did she say?
Let's stop the recording. All right, that's a good place to stop. So everybody online, thanks for seeing you. Thanks for being here tonight.
Take care.
Glad to be here.
Stay well.
Sweet dreams.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
You know Jonathan Yates very well now.
Happy birthday, Dale, yesterday.